Do Africans consider African Americans to actually be African? I'm from South Africa and no, African Americans are not considered Africans. They were born and raised in America. Their culture is uniquely theirs and they may have African ancestry but they're not African. For all intents and purposes, they're American. A lot of Africans consider them as a separate category, since most of them aren't actually African immigrants or children of African immigrants, but much further separated from any sort of African heritage. Anecdotes aren't evidence, but when I was living in Africa for a few years in a work project, my African American colleagues were often annoyed that they would be called the white guy in the local language. It because their skin color, typical African American shades, were much lighter than the native Africans were. My colleagues had a good sense of humor about it, but you could tell it upset them at first even if they kept their cool. I've heard the parents of my African, first-gen, friends talk down about African Americans. Black people from the US are considered white in Africa. This isn't specific to African Americans, but reading the responses, I'm confident I can say this quite broadly. A lot of diaspora communities are not viewed as truly their ethnicity by people in their home countries. I'm Indian American and my own extended family in India treats me differently. But that's kind of warranted because we simply did not grow up the same with the same experiences. And it's the same with interdiaspora communities too. For me, British Indians or Aussie Indians are super alien to me. We all have the common homeland. We maintain our cultures to varying degrees. Even in my own family, my parents and I immigrated but my brother was born here. And the differences between us are palpable. So at the end of the day, it comes down to the experiences we have. And, of course, it becomes more complicated with Africans, African immigrants in the West, and Black Americans because of the additional degree of separation. Black Americans who are born in North America as descendants of slaves don't often know their homelands because of that, so that missing piece can also further complicate relations. TLDR. It's all about degrees of separation. Edit. To note, I'm not really butthurt about Indians not thinking I'm Indian. I used to be, but I've come to understand why. And it speaks to why I feel so different from other diaspora Indians in different countries. It sucks when you're a minority in a majority white country and you want to be proud of your heritage. But it's also something that just makes sense. I don't. African Americans are more foreign to Africa than even many white Europeans. Surprise, surprise. Most African Americans have an absurd view of Africa and Africans. Some Africans I have spoken to have described African Americans as being sometimes snobbish and presumptive of Africans and Africa. Some Africans when they go to America don't like to be associated with African Americans. Mostly because of colonial hangover and lack of understanding. So they tend to associate themselves with whites more than AAs. I feel like once you are a generation removed it can't be assumed until you meet them. They may find some shared experiences like cuisine and language, but it will culturally find its way out in time. People in most African nations would be extremely different from first or second generations from immigrants. There's some animosity between West Indians and Africans in the UK, maybe similar in USA. No, they're Americans. Source: African. No, I do not consider African Americans to be African the same way I do not consider Jamaicans or Haitians to be African. African Americans are Americans. They are all my black brothers though. Everyone in the world consider Americans just Americans. Always. What an interesting question with very interesting replies. Thank you all for this! Exclamation mark. The vast majority of African Americans don't even like Africans. Being considered African would be an insult to them. As Muhammad Ali said, "Thanks my granddaddy got on that boat," when asked what he thought of Africa. Source: I am an African raised in US. Some of the most racist stuff told to my face were from African Americans. America tends to place a lot of importance on heritage since most of us came from somewhere else. We are a nation of immigrants. It's why a lot of people proudly identify as Irish American or Italian American or whatever. But at the same time, most of us couldn't find the places our ancestors came from on a map, and we don't have any concrete ties to wherever they lived. So the people who live there wouldn't consider us to be one of them. It's not just an black people thing. It's an American thing. Trevor Noah had a bit that he performed on Jay Leno's show from back to before he was the host of The Daily Show, where he says that African Americans are not really African. But we'll keep pretending. No. But that's more so because that isn't the definition of African American, or how it's typically used. That isn't really how Irish American is used either. TBH. But they're also not a one-to-one because Africa is an entire continent whereas Ireland is a single country. While most African Americans descend from West and Central Africa, some have ancestry stemming from as far as southeastern Africa. I also imagine that most Irish Americans are also usually pretty mixed with something else like Scottish, English, Welsh, German, etc., and that their Irish heritage may or may not be a majority of what makes up their ancestry. Whereas most African Americans are at least around 6,070% sub-Saharan African. They're just really not comparable in the weight of what they're conveying. You also have to view that from the other way around. You ask about Africans. But what Africans? Nigerians? Ghanaians? Angolans? Mozambicans? And then you have to narrow it down to the vastly different ethnic groups with different cultures and outlooks who all reside in these different countries. And you're bound to find differing opinions just within ethnic groups, let alone across them and across countries. In contrast, Ireland, again, being one country with a relatively much more homogeneous culture, is more likely to have a singular, dominant opinion on the matter. I think how broadly this question is always posited is why Africans themselves rarely actually respond to it, because they probably don't feel like their individual opinion can represent an entire continent. A lot of the African people I know who were born there won't date or get involved with African Americans for whatever reason. I knew several who, if they were white, would be called hatefully racist. Most actual Africans I know despise American blacks. They say their culture is awful and they're lazy ends and get like actually really angry talking about it because they pretty much have all said to me that they feel they get judged based on them. So no, most Africans don't claim them. I am European and I don't consider white Americans to actually be European even though they're all of European descent.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Ericast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.